Pettit and Christian List. I do so for two reasons. The first is to give more substance to Wellman's argument. And the second is to develop a criticism of Wellman's proposal, one that I hope generalizes to any attempt to ground exclusionary practices in group agency, at least as group agency is construed by Pettit and List. I argue that states do not currently have the institutional structures required to generate group rights, the sort that Wellman requires, and that we should not attempt to generate states with the requisite institutional structures. And so, the broader point of the paper is that I've noticed in the immigration literature this move that's being made that makes use of a notion of collective agency and ascribes rights to a collective agent, which is the state. And this is an argument that I think is kind of common, but not philosophically kind of remarked upon very often. And so the broader hope is that I will be able to bring this move to people's attention, and hopefully it will be subjected to greater scrutiny. So, again, this is just to give you an idea. So, Wellman has put this argument forward in a number of places. He has an article in Ethics that you may have seen, but it's the version that I'll be sort of interacting with most directly is Debating the Ethics of Immigration, his contribution, which is alongside that of Philip Cole. And Group Agency by Philip Pettit and Christian List builds upon probably 10 years worth of work that Pettit and List have been working on issues of group agency and collective rationality. So again, my two claims are that states do not currently have institutional structures required to generate group rights of the sort that Wellman requires, and two, that we should not attempt to generate states with the requisite institutional structures. So I'll read my paper if you don't mind. So the right to exclude. Wellman's argument attempts to ground the right to exclude non-citizens in a collective right to freedom of association. Here is a synopsis of his argument. So this is Wellman. In my view, legitimate political states are morally entitled to unilaterally design and enforce their own immigration policies, even if these policies exclude potential immigrants who desperately want to enter. My argument for this conclusion is straightforward and requires only three core premises. One, legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination. Two, freedom of association is an integral component of self-determination. And three, freedom of association entitles one to not associate with others. Based on this reasoning, I conclude that legitimate states may choose not to associate with foreigners, including potential immigrants, as they see fit. So what's important to see here is that according to Wellman, exclusion is grounded in a right that is not held by individual citizens of a state, but instead in a right that citizens hold collectively. As Altman and Kitt put it elsewhere, this right of self-determination is irreducibly collective and so held by the group of persons who constitute the state. For this argument to work, then, Wellman needs to construe states, and in particular legitimate states. This is a wrinkle that I won't really be addressing here, but we can give you a gloss of what they mean by legitimacy if you like. So in particular, legitimate states have to be agents in their own right, distinct from those of their constituents. Unfortunately, Wellman does not himself go into great detail about what constitutes collective agency, nor what is required for collective rights of the sort that his account requires. And so this is the move that I think is important. The claim is not that individuals, because or in virtue of the fact that they are members of the state, have rights. It is rather that the state has rights of its own. So it's uncontroversial to think, for example, that the graduating class at the University of Helsinki have rights to go to the dinner tonight across town. But that's a right that they hold in virtue of group membership, without it being the case that we think that the graduating class of 2013 is somehow an agent in its own right. And I take it that the argument that I'm interested in is one that seeks to claim that states, as states, have rights, and that the rights of states are not reducible to the rights of individuals. So it's not the case that we just cobble together a bunch of individual rights and we get the right to exclude. It's rather that there's a different entity entire, and that entity has the right to determine its own membership. This is the argument that I think is interesting. I think it's troubling. I don't like it. I'll put it in my cards on the table. but this is the argument that I think is important and that often kind of just goes under our radar. And so what I'm hoping to do here is bring it to your attention and subject it to some preliminary scrutiny, but more broadly, I just think that we should keep our eye on it. So, at this point, I think it is helpful to connect Lohmann's argument to a broader recent trend in political philosophy that seeks to recognize the rights of collective agents. This trend is most clear in Pettit and List's impressive account of group agency that I'll focus on, but there are many other examples as well. Arthur Applebaum, his recent work, makes a similar move. Estlund has an article on liberal associationism and the rights of states, where he thinks that he can extract this move from a reading of Rawls's Law of Peoples, and of course, List and Pettit. I think throughout the talks that I've done at the conference, I've heard this move made a number of times, right? This claim about collective agency, rights that stem therefrom. So, what characterizes this trend is an increasing willingness to incorporate substantive claims about group rights into theories that affirm some form of methodological individualism. As a result, I think we are observing a movement in liberal political philosophy toward the rehabilitation of notions of collective agency and group rights. The trick, of course, is finding a way of characterizing the rights of collectives that do not undermine the substantive commitment, a substantive commitment to individual rights. There are many reasons why we might be wary of group agency and group rights. Historically, concerns about fascism in particular have motivated people to reject out of hand the appropriateness of collective agency, and others may simply claim that group agency is impossible. For the purposes of my argument, I will concede that group agents can exist, and if constituted in the proper way, could have rights. Granting this possibility, however, does not lead directly, or I will argue even indirectly, to any of the conclusions put forward by Lohmann. So I'm just going to assume the in-principle claim about group agency for the sake of argument, and see if anything important follows. So what I do is I focus upon List and Pettit's recent work, especially the book Group Agency, but again, you can find almost all of what they're up to in that book in various article publications that preceded it. So List and Pettit provide an account of group agency that features or that requires three general requirements for agency. So these are supposed to be requirements for agency that describe any kind of agent. So the first feature is that it has representational states that depict how things are in the environment. It has motivational states that specify how it requires things to be, and it has, and I guess this is going to be the most important for my purposes, it has the capacity to process its representational and motivational states, leading it to intervene suitably in the environment whenever the environment fails to match a motivating specification. This is the most kind of crucial for agency according to List and Pettit. This is the feature that leads to a requirement of rationality. Right? That on their account, agency requires a kind of ability to process and revise representational states in accordance with new information, in accordance with changes in the environment, and this is going to be the central, my central concern when it comes to group agency. So one thing that is important to note here is that the account of agency that Pettit and List give is functionalist. Something's being an agent is a matter of the functions it can perform, in particular its ability to manifest the features above, not a set of material properties it must possess. This functionalism is going to be very important for the criticism that I develop later. For this reason, agency is multiply realizable. It can emerge from a number of different substrates. The general account of agency provided by List and Pettit is therefore intended to capture the kind of agency possessed by persons, some animals, and even robots or other forms of artificial intelligence. This is kind of what's interesting about it, is that they are given a kind of general account. So on List and Pettit's account, group agency is only distinctive as a form of agency in that its substrate, the stuff that the group is made out of, happens to be people who are themselves also agents. So this is all that is interesting about group agency, is that it's made up of little people. But the requirements for agency are general. So one of the most important insight of List and Pettit's account is the rejection of the view that simple majority rule is sufficient for group agency. Their argument is complicated, drawing upon the previous work on judgment aggregation, and in particular, various forms of the discursive dilemma, which is, again, work that they've been doing for several years. But the central problem that they develop is that majoritarianism is insufficient to generate collective rationality. Group agents must have what they call robust collective rationality, and this requires that they incorporate a mechanism such as a straw vote procedure, whereby structures within the agent distributes the tasks required to, and then this is what they call the straw vote procedure. So the idea here is that there have to be internal structures in an agent which can delegate various kinds of tasks in order to be able to revise, update, and make consistent its representational states. So this is just a long quote, or a long paraphrase, sorry. An agent must be able to consider the propositions on the agenda one by one or in a sequence, which may reflect either a temporal order or some specific or other priority. Take a majority vote on each proposition. If the attitude formed is consistent, the attitude's already formed, let it stand as the group attitude. If the attitude formed is not consistent with these attitudes, consider all of the different possible ways in which previously formed attitudes or the new attitude can be revised so as to restore consistency. Take a vote, deliberate, or deliberate on the possible revisions, and then assign suitable members or deputies to enact the resulting group attitudes. So what this requires, and again, this sort of stems from their third general requirement about agency, is that in order to be a collective agent, there needs to be structures in place which are capable of updating and revising the representational states of the group agent. And this is why not just any kind of structure is going to be sufficient for group agency. There's this quote that I really love from Christine Korsgaard, which is that a bag of mice might be able to might be able to move, but it cannot act. And the view that they're developing is that not just any collection of individuals is going to satisfy the demands of group agency. It requires a very specific and demanding institutional structure. In particular, what they claim is that group agency requires us to be able to manifest certain requirements of collective rationality that is institutionally quite demanding. And so it has to, on their account, a group agent must be able to do these sorts of things, which requires the delegation of tasks, and this can't be satisfied, according to List and Pettit, simply by majoritarian procedures. Right? So if all we did was take votes on every issue, according to List and Pettit, we would end up with a collective agent that had incoherent. They would often, this isn't necessary, but it would usually, or after a long enough amount of time, basic majoritarian would lead to an incoherent set of beliefs. And you need this kind of procedure in order to render beliefs consistent. So we see here that the organizational demands of group agency on List and Pettit's account are rather demanding. In order to qualify as an agent, a group must be capable of authorizing and empowering various subgroups, called specialists, to perform a number of distinct, sensitive, and interrelated tasks. In particular, agency requires that groups satisfy stringent norms of belief consistency and completeness. Furthermore, it means that the organizational structure of the group will partially determine the beliefs of the group agent. Most important for my purposes, group agents must be capable of delegating important and consequential tasks to formal institutional substructures that are not themselves bound to majoritarian or even democratic methods. And so, this is, we talk about group agency all the time, and this is, I think, the appeal of the proposal. We make claims about what AIG, a large corporation, thinks and does and how to anticipate its behaviors. We sometimes talk about, a musical group that's several people. We talk about like what Led Zeppelin was doing at a specific time in their career. But in order for this to make sense, according to List and Pettit, there actually have to be fairly demanding structures in place that allow us to talk meaningfully about the group agent rather than just having an informal stand-in talk for what individual members are doing. So that's to say that They're not skeptical, obviously, about the possibility of group agents, but in the case of, let's say, AIG, it makes sense insofar as there really are those institutional structures in place. Right? We have a committee or some kind of formal governance structure, and it actually has these kinds of structures in place. So what I hope to do here is develop a criticism of Wellman that is, so I'll just read. I believe that Wellman's argument, supplemented with Liston and Pettit's account of group agency, provides the most interesting, philosophically sophisticated defense of the right to exclude in the literature. I don't think, however, that it is successful in establishing its conclusions. And I hope that the failure of Wellman's argument is constructed more broadly. In this section, I lay out three interrelated criticisms that seek to undermine the idea that group agency can provide an adequate ground for the right to exclude. The problems I present here are specific to the Wellman, List, and Pettit hybrid, but I hope to show in the future that group agents in general are poor candidates for grounding the right to exclude. So you'll notice that the first problem is more general, the second is quite strongly tied to List and Pettit, but I think that the third point is actually general as well. So we begin with the scope problem. Wellman's argument requires that legitimate states have a right to collective self-determination. What he means by the state, however, is left rather vague. Is the state comprised of only elected officials, or is it the entirety of a government's bureaucracy? Does it comprise all voters in a given democracy, or does the state include all of its citizens? My first criticism asserts that it matters how we here define the state, and that the best candidates for statehood that can support the right to exclude are the least likely to satisfy the demands of group agency. As a result, I think there is a scope problem for Wellman's argument. If the state is to have the right to exclude, it must be a group agent. But the only groups that have the institutional structures requisite to satisfy the demands of group agency do not seem to be of the right sort to determine membership. Here's the general thought. When we talk about states being group agents, and we focus on the formal governmental structures, this seems to make some sense, right? States, when we think of one of Wellman's examples, is, I think is yours, Canada signed NAFTA, right? What it means when we say Canada signed NAFTA, we're talking about a group agent that is really the formal governmental structure of the Canadian government. So it has the kind of contours institutionally that satisfy, I take it, or it could satisfy List and Pettit's demands. But viewed that narrowly, I don't think that the government of Canada has the right to exclude. Right? The right to exclude would seem to inhere in something that's bigger than just, what Marxists call a state. Right? The limited group of individuals that happen to occupy bureaucratic positions of power. The right to exclude, if it makes sense, I think, has to adhere in a broader group. And so the scope problem is that agency seems to make sense for the smallest possible consideration of the group. But that doesn't seem sufficient to generate the right. So in general, the group that seems most agent-like in a state is the formal governmental structure. Drawing upon List and Pettit here, we see that this narrow understanding of the state is appealing because it has a well-defined institutional structure that is capable, at least in principle, of delegating important tasks relating to belief consistency and completeness. Thus, it is at least possible that states construed as the formal structure of government could satisfy the demands of robust collective rationality. For example, we can imagine a state embodying the requirements of a straw vote procedure. I don't believe, however, that the state thus narrowly defined can have the right to exclude. That is because the government is not itself capable of generating a moral right to exclude individuals from membership in the country. The reason for this seems to be that it is only the state widely construed that could have the right to exclude. The formal structure of government is not the state in the sense required to ground a right to exclude. So then we have to ask whether a wider construal of the state can also support the assertion that the state is a group agent. If we construe the state as the group of all voters, it may or may not make sense to claim that it is a group agent. depending upon how the electoral process works and how the system of representation is understood, maybe it's the case that the state thus construed can satisfy the demands of robust collective rationality. I'm not sure, but this is something that I go back and forth on. But once again, I don't think that the state defined in terms merely of voters has the right to exclude. Once again, the collective is drawn too narrowly for it to have such a right. The right to exclude, if it is a collective right, would seem to adhere in the group of citizens, all citizens of the state, the largest possible constellation. But given that this collective, which includes children, the disenfranchised, and non-voters, is not part of any robust institutional structure capable of generating collective rationality, I cannot see how it can be a collective agent. The state is construed in a way that is broad enough to generate the right to exclude others from membership. For example, the group of all citizens needs to be so broad that it as to outstrip the formal institutions required for agency. So do we see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to say that we have to decide what the state is, and the best candidates for satisfying the demands of agency, I think, are the least likely to support the moral claim about having the right to exclude. So, if the argument above is correct, there is a mismatch between the scope of the group that could satisfy the institutional demands of agency and the scope of any group that could possess the moral right to exclude. That's the first problem. The second problem specifically results from functionalism about agency that we find in List and Pettit. Even if it were possible for the state, under some specification, to constitute a collective agent, I argue, relying on anything like List and Pettit's argument leads to an important problem. If we take their functionalist argument seriously, then all that Wellman can claim is that some legitimate states are agents. That is, we have succeeded in an impressive feat of social engineering, a feat basically akin to the development of artificial intelligence. We have added a new agent to the world. But it is importantly just one more agent. This, I think, I don't think this generalizes, but I wish that it did. On List and Pettit's account, we have a bunch of different ways that we can create new agents. One is you can tinker with artificial intelligence, come up with a robot that's actually an agent. Congratulations. You can also just have a kid. We've been doing this for a long time. But what this means is that collective agents, states, are just agents. Right? If you're really a functionalist, states don't have any different rights than individuals. And so then the claim that Wellman makes that while states have a right to freedom of association that's analogous to the right of individuals, because we have the right to freedom of association, we relies heavily on the analogy of marriage, this is what grounds for Wellman the right to exclude. But I think that's wrong if we rely upon List and Pettit, because on List and Pettit's account, the group agent would just be an agent. It would have the same rights as any other agent. And we don't have the right to exclude people from our states. And I don't think the state, construed as an agent, would have that right either. Right? You can't have it both ways. The whole point of functionalism is the whole point of functionalism and multiple right realizability is that the substratum used to generate agents is not essential to agency. What matters is that agents are capable of forming representational and motivational states, and that it is capable of processing and acting on them in the right way. But we can't then have it both ways. If the substratum doesn't matter, then the fact that collective agents are made up of individual agents can't mean that they're somehow more important, or of rights that do not inhere in individuals. As a result, I do not see why collective agents would have a right to exclude non-citizens, since individual citizens do not have such a right. If this argument is correct, then group agents, despite the enormous difficulty involved in the design and implementation, are not particularly significant politically. So again, this is arguing against List and Pettit. They don't make these moves. But if we take their functionalism seriously, I think that this is an inevitable consequence. Agents are just agents. You can make them out of whatever you want, but if you make an agent out of other agents, you've just made one more agent. And so it's a deflationary account that I'm trying to give group agents. How much time do I have left?
About 2 minutes.
The last problem concerns institutional design. So in particular, as List on his own has shown, there are a number of incompatible desiderata for the design of democratic institutions that conflict with collective agency. In fact, List proposes what he calls the democratic trilemma. For all but the simplest collective decision problems, no decision procedure can meet all of the requirements of robustness to pluralism, basic majoritarianism, and collective rationality. According to List, the institutional demands of collective agency cannot be satisfied without sacrificing some degree of either pluralism, the robustness of pluralism, or majority rule. This is due to the fact that collective agency requires that groups ensure the completeness of their beliefs. This, however, cannot be done unless we either exclude in advance certain sets of beliefs from consideration, thus reducing the pluralist aspect of democracy, or we remove certain decisions from the control of the electorate, thus reducing the majoritarian aspect of democracy. And this is, List is a formalist, and so he's derived this in an article in Philosophy and Public Affairs called The Logical State of Democracy. But the point, I think, is more intuitive than that. Collective agency is one way that we could go about designing institutions in a democracy. We could design institutions in a democracy to mimic and to produce group agents. But that's just one option that we have. Another option is that we could try and increase majority control, or we could attempt to make it as open to different perspectives and to different points of view as possible. And we have to make choices, and if we choose collective rationality, we have to diminish these other desiderata. So, given the deflationary account of agency developed in the last objection, it is not at all clear to me why we should prioritize collective agency over these other institutional desiderata. That is, why should we be willing to either make institutions more insular or diminish the responsiveness of democracies to the judgments of majority if the only upshot of doing so is the creation of one more agent? Because collective agency requires new and costly institutional arrangements, it requires some compelling moral justification. Given the problems above, I do not see the wisdom of incurring these costs. So, to conclude quickly, as a result of these arguments, as a result of the three arguments developed in the last section, I conclude that no existing state is a group agent, because no existing state has the kind of institutional structure necessary for robust rationality. While it seems plausible that some governments might be structured in a way that suffices to make them group agents, it is not at all clear to me why government should be afforded any significant moral or political status. Since the right to exclude seems to be a right that must adhere in the group of all citizens, or more precisely, the whole group of individuals whose membership is being defined, then there is a mismatch between the group that is supposed to hold the right to collective self-determination, that is the group of all citizens, and the group best suited to the demands of group agency. This is important because the right to exclude is supposed to derive from the fact that a legitimate state, and not some exclusive subset of that state, is determining its own will on the subject. In addition, I conclude that generating the sorts of institutional structures required for group agency would be inappropriate, and that we should not attempt to do so. Good government requires that more than collective self-determination, it requires that institutions can limit and restrain our collective decisions in order to ensure they are more prudent and just. As a result, I conclude that if there is any right to exclude others, it must be grounded elsewhere than in the conception of group agents.
Thank you.